Hi, Crosspoint family, and welcome to week 15 of the Deep Roots devotional series. This week, we'll be covering the topic of how man relates to God, specifically by discussing the Ten Commandments from Exodus 20, verses 1 to 17. Let me first say how much I miss seeing all of you in person. I have very much enjoyed our live stream services that Ed and Eddie have been putting together, and very grateful for them leading us through those. And I'm grateful for having the technology that allows us to interact with each other even from a distance. But I'm very much looking forward to seeing you all face to face, hopefully sometime soon. I also want to thank Stephen and Michael for sending out the last couple of Deep Roots devotionals. I very much enjoyed watching those. But anyways, we get into this week's devotional. We're going to be covering the Ten Commandments. And specifically, we're going to cover a couple of questions. First being just what are the Ten Commandments? The next is we'll get into, are there ways that I'm not living up to God's standard, and why does it matter? And then how do I need to change my living? So as we consider these things, we'll first go through what are the Ten Commandments. And this is pretty simple. I know most of us are familiar with the Ten Commandments, but just by a little bit way of background, the Ten Commandments are basically a list of instructions that God gave directly to Moses at Mount Sinai to give to the Israelites. And this was in about the third month after they left Egypt, and they were wandering in the desert. And God called Moses up to Mount Sinai in order to give them some instructions. So if you think back over, just to kind of put yourself in their place, what the Israelites have been through recently, they witnessed the plagues in Egypt and the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. God has provided them with manna and quail from heaven to provide them with something to eat, and water from a rock. And so this is just sort of the situation that the Israelites were in as they're wandering in the desert. And God comes to a point where he wants to consecrate his people and further set them apart as his people. And so in order to do that, he wants to provide them with some specific instructions. And so we come to Exodus 20, and this is the list of the Ten Commandments. I'm not going to go through all of the verses at this time, but we'll break down a little bit further. But I wanted to go back a chapter to give a little bit of background, again, of where the Israelites are at this moment. And I wanted to go to chapter 19, verses 4 to 6. And this is God speaking to Moses, again, at Mount Sinai. And he says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So that's in chapter 19. So now when we get to chapter 20, God calls Moses again in order to give him some specific instructions to bring back to the people. And with these instructions, God intends to both mark his people by distinguishing them from other nations, and he's giving them specific instructions on how to live in right relationship both with himself and with each other, and how to prosper. So now we look at the commandments themselves when we get to Exodus 20, and I want to break them into two groups for us to look at. So the first four commandments relate to man's relationship with God, or the sort of the vertical relationship between man and God. These first four are: you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not make for yourself an idol, you shall not take the Lord's your God's name in vain, and remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Now this, if you remember in Matthew 22, when Jesus sort of sums up the law and the prophets, and the first commandment he mentions is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so this, again, relates to that vertical relationship between man and God. And these first 4 commandments are intended to instruct the people on how to properly give God his glory and honor as creator and Lord over all. And then the second grouping is the other 6 commandments. And as you can see, these commandments relate to man's relationship with one another, or those horizontal relationships between each other. And these relate to the second great commandment that Jesus mentions in Matthew 22. The second is like it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets, Jesus says. So he's summing up all of the law and the prophets in these 2 commandments of love the Lord your God and then love your neighbor as yourself. And so the 10 commandments can be split into similar categories of relating to that vertical relationship between God and man, and a horizontal relationship between fellow men. So this second group of commandments teach the people how to live in harmony with each other so that they might, as it says in the 5th commandment, live long in the land the Lord your God has given them. So I think I separated it into these 2 specific groups because I think there's something important in looking at the order in which God gives the commandments. First the vertical, and then the horizontal. I think he's saying we must first focus on our relationship with God. We must rightly order our lives to show him the honor, respect, and glory that he deserves. And only then will we be in a position to relate properly to one another. So as we discussed through these commandments, God is interacting directly with his people in order to both mark them as his, to distinguish them from other nations, as he says, again, back in chapter 19, to be his kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And he is also giving them instructions for how to live and how to prosper in this life. How to live in right relationship with God first, and then with each other second. So that's the overview of what are the 10 commandments. The next questions are there ways I'm not living up to God's standard, and why does it matter? To the first question, undoubtedly there are many ways that we do not live up to God's standard. Obviously, we are all sinners. But what is a way that we can evaluate our shortcomings and ways that we fall short of God's standard? Now, I would encourage you to first look at that vertical relationship. In what ways am I denying God his rightful honor and glory by placing other things ahead of him? What are the idols in my life? And then after that, look horizontally. Are there ways that I have wronged someone, or someone has wronged me? Have I lied or stolen or coveted? Those sorts of things from the second group of commandments. Again, it's important to order those rightly. First, consider the vertical, and then the horizontal. And the second part of this question, why does it matter? Well, I think it is important to remember that God did not just give us his commandments as a list of rules for us to follow in order to get us to do what he wants. But ultimately, they are for our own good. As we talked about earlier in Exodus 19, just before he gave the 10 commandments, God promised the people that they would be his treasured possession, which, by the way, his possessions include everything, as he immediately follows in that verse with, for all the earth is mine. Now, you might ask, is this just an Old Testament thing? Are we called to follow God's commands in the same way in the New Testament? Or more specifically, you might ask, what does Jesus have to say? So I wanted to bring you some of Jesus's own words on following God's commands. And that comes from John 15, verses 10 to 11. It says, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. So obedience allows us to abide in his love, that have that right vertical relationship, so that our joy may be full. It is for our own good that we obey God's commands. So the next question in the application questions is, how do I need to change my living? Now, this is obviously a question that will look different for each one of us. We all must look at our own lives and ask ourselves this question. But remember, it's important when we look at our shortcomings to not fall into condemnation. Remember that we're called to obey his commands for our own good, that through obedience, we are blessed, most importantly, by growing closer to God, the Father, and to Christ himself, to again abide in his love, as he says in John 15. And through growing closer to God, his blessings flow out into the rest of our lives. And remember, too, it's important to remember that he has not left us alone to go through this journey on our own. Remember, he has given us the Spirit to guide and direct us through this journey. Some more words from Jesus in John 14, verses 15 to 17. He says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you." Remember, God has given us his own Spirit to guide and direct our steps. And I also would encourage you to remember that God has also given us each other. He has given us the church body to lift us up and encourage us to press on in obedience. So I would encourage you to seek fellowship with your fellow believers for support and encouragement and accountability. Remember, none of us are meant to go through this walk alone. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you so much for your time. Again, I can't wait to see all of you again in person. But in God's perfect timing, we will be together again. So thank you, and God bless.